If you're doing hundreds and hundreds of coding interview questions and you still find that you can't actually pass a coding interview, I'm sorry, but you're not studying for coding interviews correctly. It's not that complicated and you don't need to do that many questions. So I want to walk you through exactly how I would go about studying for coding interviews if you want to get a job as a software engineer. So the first thing you need to do, and by far the biggest mistake I see a lot of people making, is skipping this step, and that is that you need to learn data structures and algorithms to some degree of proficiency. So specifically, I would focus on strings and arrays, linked lists, stacks and queues, hash tables, and then trees and graphs. And of course, there's a ton of other data structures out there, and they can be sort of interesting to learn about, but as far as actually studying for coding interviews, these are going to be the most important ones. You also want to make sure that you have a good fundamental understanding of complexity analysis. So this is going to be big O notation and how you can use it to represent the time and space complexity of your algorithms. And full disclosure, I've been involved in AlgoExpert for a few years now, and I do have some financial incentives tied to the company, but I also used it as a customer before I was ever involved. And I wanted to point out that they do have a data structures crash course, and this is a great place to start if you are an AlgoExpert subscriber and you're just trying to make sure that you actually understand the fundamentals of data structures, so you can see all of the different data structures I talked about here, complexity analysis, big O notation, as well as they have a section on logarithms, which come up a lot in big O notation and complexity analysis, as well as memory. And of course, there's tons of other resources and courses out there, but I just wanted to point out that if you are using AlgoExpert, that this is there included for you. And now the next step that you should take is to focus on easy problems. And I know easy problems aren't really the ones that are going to come up in actual coding interviews all that often, but they are things that you should focus on to begin with. The reason for this is, one, it just sort of builds some confidence, but it also builds a sort of process and a structure for how you are going to be practicing coding interview questions. Additionally, even if these questions don't come up in coding interviews, which I actually have been asked easy questions a few times, so it can happen, but also even if they don't, a lot of these questions are sort of sub-problems for other problems. So a lot of these solutions to these easy problems can be helpful in solving the mediums and hards that we'll be looking at in a bit. And now for each question, this is what I would actually do. So this is the validate subsequence question on AlgoExpert. This is an easy question in the array category. And the first thing to do is, of course, just read the question, read the sample input and the sample output, and make sure that you understand it. But with understanding it, treat it like a real interview. And something you want to do in every real interview you have is ask some clarifying questions. These are important to understand that you actually understand the question and to demonstrate to the interviewer that you are sort of thinking critically about the question they just asked you. Of course, when you're studying at home, you don't have somebody to actually ask these to, and you're not going to get a response back. And these are typically written in a way to make sure that you don't have questions to ask just because there's nobody to ask them to, versus in person, you have a human explaining things and they might leave something out by mistake. But anyways, try to come up with some clarifying questions that you would ask. So some common questions to ask are going to be things like, what is the format of the input? What is the expected format of the output going to look like? And just generally, what are some of the different constraints that we need to deal with? And then of course, if you're confused about any of the other wording in the question, you would want to ask those questions as well. And really the point here is just to practice as closely as possible to the actual interview, and this is something you are going to be doing in actual interviews. And next, I would focus on trying to solve the problem, but do so without writing any code. So on AlgoExpert, you can use the scratch pad if you want. This is just an area where you can sort of type out your notes, or you can use a physical piece of paper or whiteboard or whatever you want to use, but just practice actually sort of thinking through the solution and think out loud. So actually verbally articulate what are the things you're thinking about, what are the different possible solutions you're thinking about. And with each of these, try to discuss what are going to be the trade-offs. So this is oftentimes in terms of time and space complexity, but it can be in other things too, like the complexity of the actual code that you would have to write. Next, if you can't come up with a solution after say 5 to 10 minutes, I would look at the hints. So if we come back to the prompt and we scroll down, all of the questions have some hints. So I would go through these hints and see if they help sort of walk you through how to get to a solution. And you'll find that in some cases, this helps you a lot. And this is pretty typical of an actual interview, because if you struggle for 5 to 10 minutes, usually the interviewer will give you some kind of hint to push you in the correct direction. And sometimes this is super helpful, and other times you look at these hints, whether it be on AlgoExpert or a physical interviewer, and you're like, this isn't answering my questions at all. I still don't understand this. And that's fine. Think about it for a few more minutes. But if after say 5 to 10 minutes after looking at these hints, you still can't figure it out, don't just sit there for hours and hours sort of like banging your head against against the wall, it's not going to be helpful. Instead, it's time to look at the solution. And what I would do is start with the video explanation. And all of the videos on AlgoExpert are broken into two sections, a conceptual overview and a code walkthrough. So I would watch the conceptual overview. So what this is going to be is it's going to be this sort of virtual whiteboard walking through how you can solve this problem. But this isn't going to involve any code. This is completely programming language agnostic, and it's just about a high level how to think about this problem from sort of a data structures and algorithms perspective. And then what I would do is after watching that conceptual overview, don't watch the code walkthrough just yet. Instead, just come over here and try to implement the solution yourself. Try to take the thing you just learned in that conceptual overview and see if you can apply it to actually writing this code yourself. And now again, as you're writing this code, think out loud. And this should not be write a bunch of code and then discuss what that code was. No, it should be as you are writing code, explain what you are thinking about, explain why you're writing it in the way you're doing it, and what that code that you're currently writing is going to do. Now, this does not mean that you need to teach the interviewer what a for loop is and all of these things. They know that you know that, but you should be explaining why are you doing things in the way you're doing them. And then after you write a bit of code, it is good to also stop for a second and say, this is what I just wrote, and this is the purpose of this thing, just to make sure that you're always on the same page with your interviewer, and they know that you're not just regurgitating something you memorized, but you are actually thinking critically and you understand the code you're writing. And then before you hit this magical submit code button down here, which is going to run it against a ton of test cases to make sure it actually works, what I would do is come down to this quick test area. And this is going to allow you to put in whatever input you want to test it against different edge cases. And this is something you'll do in a lot of real coding interviews. They're going to ask you to think about different edge cases to make sure that your code actually works with those edge cases. So think about sort of the standard input, then think about things like empty inputs, and think about things like duplicated values and inputs if they're allowed by the question, and just think about all of these different possible scenarios and see if you can write some tests for them to see if your code actually works. And then of course, once you are confident that your code is working, then you can come down here and click the magical submit code button to see if it is actually working and if it passes all of the different tests. And if it does fail one of the test cases, then go back to that test case, look at it and try to manually sort of walk through that test case and see where your code went wrong and see if you can fix it. Again, making sure that you are articulating this out loud and acting like it is in a real interview. And now if you aren't able to get your code to work, then what you can do is come back to the video explanation and go to the code walkthrough, or you can just go to solutions and you can look at these solutions that way. So for example, here is the solution to is valid subsequence. And oftentimes there are multiple different solutions. So we can see we have solution 2 and solution 1. So you can see the different possible ways to actually implement that solution. But if you did manage to actually get your code to work, especially without looking at any of the solutions, great job, but that does not mean you are done. There is still one step that a lot of people skip. A lot of people see, oh, passed all test cases, time to move on, but that's not the case because in a real interview, there's one more step, and that is the time and space complexity. So our complexity analysis. So look back at your code and analyze it again out loud, actually discuss what you're thinking about. Don't just say, oh, this is ov-in. Say this is ov-in because of this reason, and say where in is whatever in actually represents. Don't just say, oh, this is ov-in or oh, this is in squared. You have to actually explain what exactly that means and show your interviewer that you are, again, thinking critically. And if you're using AlgoExpert and want to make sure you are actually correct on that, it is at the top of all of the solutions, or in the prompt, you can come down here and see optimal space and time complexity, and it is repeated down there as well. And now once you got to this point, you need to categorize this question in one of two different ways. Number one is going to be, I solved this, I didn't need the video explanation, I didn't need the solutions, I was able to just figure it out. In which case, check, time to move on. But possibility number two, and this is one that does happen a lot, but people don't think about too often, could be, well, I solved this using a bit of the video explanation or the solutions or some of the hints, which is fine. That's what all of those things are there for, but that doesn't really mean that you individually solved it. So what I would do is mark the question to actually come back to later and come back to it after at minimum a few days, if not wait like a week and then come back to that question and try to solve it again. And the point of doing this is just to make sure that it's not just in your short-term memory, but that you actually learned something new and that now you can solve that problem on your own. And essentially what I would do is rinse and repeat this process for a few different easy questions until you feel fairly confident that you can get most of the easy questions right on your own. And then it is time to move on. This does not mean just start moving on to doing a bunch of medium and hard questions, because I do think there's a step in between, again, a step that a lot of people skip. Because we talk a lot about data structures and algorithms, But really, we tend to study more of data structures than studying the specific algorithms associated with them. But I would take some time to actually study some of the common algorithms that come up a lot in coding interviews. So specifically, this is going to be binary search and merge sort. There are other sorting algorithms that can be important, but merge sort I think is by far the most common one that you need to know. And then you'll want to learn the different tree traversals. So this is going to be in order, pre-order, and post-order traversals. And you'll want to make sure you also know how to search through graphs using breadth first search and depth first search. And both of these can be done iteratively as well as recursively. So make sure you know how to implement both, and you should be able to create the implementations of both in whatever programming language you're using very, very quickly. It should be essentially automatic. And with graphs, there's lots of other common algorithms, but the most common other than breadth first search and depth first search is probably going to be Dijkstra's algorithm. So if you can, I would also learn Dijkstra's. Finally, I would take a look at greedy algorithms, which is more of a category of algorithm than a specific algorithm, but I would go through a few of the greedy algorithm questions. And then I would also learn about dynamic programming, which again is more of a category than a specific question, but I would learn about bottom-up and top-down dynamic programming and how to solve sort of basic dynamic programming questions, because these do come up from time to time. And there are some very difficult dynamic programming questions out there, but you don't need to focus on these just yet. At this point, just focus on some of the easier ones and make sure that you understand the fundamentals of dynamic programming as sort of a concept. And there are going to be other patterns that come up a lot. For example, things like the sliding window pattern. And just as you are working through questions and you notice a pattern that's similar to another question you've done before, maybe mark that down somewhere, take a note to remember, hey, this is a pattern I've seen multiple times now. It's probably fairly important and I should make sure that I know how to do this thing. But anyways, now that you understand these algorithms and you can implement them very easily and quickly, I would move on to mediums and hards. I would probably do something like 3 mediums for every 1 hard, but it sort of just depends on yourself and how confident you are with those mediums. And if the hards are just way too hard for you at this point, then focus on just the mediums. Additionally, if you're applying for, say, an internship versus a senior engineering position, the distribution you might want to do of mediums to hards might be a little bit different. Another thing you could try to do at this point is some mock interviews. So if you're using AlgoExpert, there's a mock coding interview section where essentially you can do a mock interview with another user on AlgoExpert. So you just mention what languages you want to use, as well as what languages you can actually read. So you're going to be interviewing the other person. So what languages you're comfortable being the interviewer for, and what types of questions you want. So easy, medium, hard, or very hard. So essentially, where exactly are you at this point to make sure that you aren't asked something that you have no chance of getting correct. Or of course, if you want, there's tons of other ways to do mock interviews. In my case, I did a lot of them just with my friends, so that can be a thing you can do as well. And now people always ask, how many questions do you actually need to do? And I know people who have done hundreds and hundreds of questions and sometimes still struggled to get that job. And I also know people who have done 10, 20, 30 questions and easily were able to just completely ace all of their coding interviews. So it really is just going to depend on the individual. We all sort of start at different places, right? If, say, you have a master's degree in computer science and you've taken a bunch of data structures courses at a university, you're probably going to start at a different place than somebody who's self-taught or a bootcamp grad who might have less experience with data structures and algorithms. Some people are also just naturally better at the actual process of interviewing itself and sort of thinking out loud and all of those things, and other people need to practice that more. So really the point is that there is no magic number, but just do know that if you are one of those people who's hundreds of questions deep and you still feel like you can't confidently pass a coding interview, that you should probably go back towards the beginning of this video and make sure that you have a good fundamental understanding of those data structures and the algorithms. I've seen some people trying to just like grind out coding interview questions, but they're still struggling with concepts like loops and functions. And if this is you, you need to focus on those things before you'll be able to actually pass the coding interviews. It's also worth noting that there's been an interesting uptick recently of people trying to essentially cheat in coding interviews. So if you're curious about that, you should watch this video next.